Hey there, and welcome to Understanding the Bible. We are in our final lesson on Revelation, and this has been a big study with a lot of different stuff. We're actually on our third category of different ways to interpret Revelation, so there's a lot going on. We started out by looking at four views to kind of read Revelation and the events within them, asking, were these events which are describing kind of a roadmap for big events throughout history? That's how the historicists have interpreted it. And that was a view that used to be popular and is not so much anymore. Or is Revelation about events that happened in the past, in the first century? This is the preterist view. Alternatively, Revelation could be about events in the future. This is a very common futurist view. Or lastly, maybe Revelation is talking about ideals and principles that apply to many events, not some specific events in the past or the future. And this is the idealist view. So those were four different ways, and that's been the framework for most of our study for looking at Revelation. That's taken us at least through chapters like 4 through chapters 19. But last week, as we got into Revelation 20, looking at the Millennium, we had to ask a different question. We asked, when is Jesus coming back in relation to the Millennium? And so there were a few different views. One answer to that question is that Jesus is returning before the Millennium. This is premillennialism. Alternatively, Jesus could be returning after the Millennium, post-Millennium. Or amillennialists hold that Revelation 20 and this idea of the 1,000 years is not telling us when Jesus will return. It's not weighing in on that, the amillennialist position. So we've had all of this going on, and now in this final section, as we look at the last two chapters of Revelation, we have a new question, and one that's kind of been coursing throughout underneath all of these other views, and that is, how literally are we to interpret it? And so as we read this section, the question is this literally talking about a future event with a physical new world created, or is it being symbolic? Is it talking about a non-literal world, or is this not even talking about a literal future event, but rather a present reality? And that's the question for today. It has been a struggle throughout Revelation because there are so many symbols that when is something symbolic and when is it literal, or what is it symbolic of, has been the key fundamental challenge. But with the exception of the futurist view, literalism has not been as important because with past events, when you're claiming that an event is symbolic of something, that kind of answers some of the literalism debate right from the start. But here, we don't have that. So let's go ahead and dive in and see why. What are some of the strengths and the arguments for the literalist position? What are they saying, and why are they saying it? At the big picture level, the literalist interpretation of Revelation 21 and 22 is saying that this is a literal future event in which God will literally make a new heaven and earth. So God will make a literal new world. The idea here is that we're talking about a material, real new earth. Now, there are some variations within this view on the different elements here, like where it's being symbolic and where it's being literal. But at this big picture level, it's definitely literal. That's what this view is claiming. On the other hand, the non-literalist position can be divided into two main camps. And the first camp is agreeing that this is literally a future event. So there's no disagreement on that. The question is whether it's a literal physical earth. Instead, some claim this is symbolic of the spiritual realities in the non-material existence in heaven. So the future reality with God is going to not be material, or at least this isn't telling us anything about it. It's going to be this spiritual relationship in heaven, and this is a picture of what that looks like. So that's the first of the non-literalist views, and it's agreement that it's a future event. However, there's also a reading of this passage that looks at it as being symbolic, but symbolic of a present reality. So some people read Revelation 21 and 22 and they say, this is actually about what it means to be a believer now. This is symbolic. The idea of there being no temple in the holy city, of God dwelling amongst us, is a description of the life as a believer now. That what we see with Jerusalem is a symbol for the church. Those who hold this view think that this passage is saying something very similar to what Paul was saying in 2 Corinthians 5:17, where he said, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, this person is a new creation. The old things passed away. Behold, the new things have come." This was a description of the present reality of believers. And that's what they're seeing is going on in Revelation 21 and 22, a description of the present reality of believers. And these are very different interpretations, aren't they? But what are some arguments for each one? So let's begin by looking at the literalist view and seeing some strengths of this position. And we're going to break this down first by looking at whether or not this is a future event, and then whether this is a material reality. So as far as the future, when you read Revelation 21 and 22, there are some things that simply are not true in our present reality. Right now, there is death, mourning, crying, and pain. This doesn't seem to be symbolic. Like, what would this be symbols of? And even if it were symbolic, saying that there's going to be a time when there isn't those things, like, that's not a description of now. There is no way that that sentence would make sense to our present reality. And if that sentence doesn't make sense to our present reality, if other parts of this passage don't make sense, then it can't be talking exclusively about our present reality. It has to be talking about something in the future, or it has to be not true. I mean, I think that would be a logical way of looking at this. Furthermore, throughout Revelation, there's a prominent theme that martyrs are going to enjoy this reality. Now, if this is describing the present church age and the experience of Christians, how exactly are martyrs joining in with that? There are simply some elements here that don't make any sense in our present reality. So it seems like I've ruled out the non-future position here, that this is not a literal future event. But what about the non-literalist response? Like, what would they say? What is the reason that they would even hold this position? And I think it's primarily about some of the descriptions being so similar to our present reality. And we saw that with the idea of a new creation, but you really see it with this idea of what is the picture, the overall picture in this passage of what it means to live in relationship with God. So the image here is of God coming down to earth and dwelling with people, of Jerusalem coming down and being the holy city. But notice there's no temple, right? The relationship is direct between God and believers. And this really is a picture of what it's like to live as believers. We do see in Jesus an introduction of something new, of this system of relating to God in a new way. The idea for those who hold this view, this is fundamentally talking about a new covenant, which is describing something which has already occurred. And there is some overlap in that. There are also some elements in the passage that are hard to match with like a future literal new kingdom of God reigning on earth. For example, we see the nations being described here. And it's odd. Like, if all the believers are worshiping God together here, who are the nations? What's the relationship here? And then just some physical issues like, what does it mean to not have a son? What does it mean to, how can all of the believers throughout all of time be here in Jerusalem? There's some questions that are a little bit hard to work out. And so that creates some tension with the first view, at least with the literalist view overall. So what are you to make of these two positions? I would argue first that this is definitely saying at least something about the future. So those who hold that this is not at all literal in its description, that it's about the future, that it's only symbolic of our present reality, I think are misreading the text. The text simply has things that are not true of our present reality. So either the future's position is correct, that is talking exclusively about the future, that's what the vision's about, that's what God is revealing, or at some level, the text is speaking to our present reality, but also pointing to something bigger. We have this idea, maybe we see even here of of a marriage, right? That in the present age, we're living in a state of engagement, right? Like before the marriage, you have an engagement, and there's an element, there's the relational element, but that in the marriage, it's going to be made complete. The idea of already, but not yet. And so I think that's another possible reading of the text that this is describing that Revelation does have in mind our present reality, but that this present reality is going to be fulfilled in a more complete and total way in the future. So that was question number one. Question number two is, how material is this? As I've suggested, this passage is, in my opinion, definitely to some extent and significant extent speaking of an actual future event. So in this future event, is it a material event where a new universe, a new world, a new earth is created? Or is it non-material? And so let's look at the kind of strengths of the literalist position first. Literalists would point to the clear language of the text, which I don't know that is compelling. Like, clearly there are symbolic elements here in this text that can't be read literally. So I don't think that you can merely point to the text and say, well, it says it, so that doesn't work when you have so much symbolic elements. However, as you read throughout all of Revelation, it is very grounded about things happening on earth, and there doesn't appear to be a sense that is talking up to this point ever about spiritual realities that are not to be experienced on earth. So if Revelation 21 and 22 were to be symbolic when it's talking about earth versus like heaven or God's realm, that would be a dramatic change. And so I think the literalist position would be, why is that change happening? There's nothing here to indicate it, so we should keep reading it the way we have been reading it. And Revelation has never diminished the physical experience. In fact, it's always focused on the material. It's always been grounded in the material. Another element is what the imagery would mean. So you're saying, okay, let's say that this is a imagery and it's being symbolic. What is it being symbolic of? When you have Jerusalem coming from heaven to earth, what is that a symbol for? It's a symbol for God's reign coming to earth, right? So I think there is a strong case here for material view. But what about the non-material, the like non-literalist position that this is talking about the symbolic nature? What's the strength of that position? The biggest argument is how much of Revelation is symbolic, and that the normative way of reading Revelation is through symbol. That usually in Revelation, what it's describing has a symbolic nature. So even if it's talking about events on earth, they're being described in symbolic ways. So when it describes the beast coming out of the sea is a physical thing on earth, but this is a symbolic image. And so they're saying the same principle is being used here to interpret a new heaven, a new earth as symbolic. Furthermore, there are some physical aspects of literalist interpretation of this passage which can be challenging. So you have this idea, for example, of there not being any light. Like, what exactly is that saying if that's like describing a literal material earth? That we have a universe where light is not necessary to grow stuff? What kind of earth is that? Are we describing an event where planets no longer orbit? It's odd. And so the quick way out of this is to say this whole thing is symbolic. It's not describing earth at all, but rather just an image of what life would be like in heaven, that we're going to be with God, that he is going to be reigning, that he is going to dwell among us, that his light will guide us. And that's just a symbolic language. And again, to weigh in on this, I do think this position raises some concerns about over-literalizing and reading it. I don't think it would be wise to read Revelation at all and look at it as a literal roadmap with no interpretation at all. There are clearly symbols. The description of what life on this new earth like is symbolic. The vision that is given to John about that old passing away and the new coming has a rich symbolic meaning to it. However, I think the arguments for a grounded material world are strong. I think this is not describing disembodied life in a spiritual sense. So is this giving us a perfect roadmap for what it's going to look like in the future? I don't think it is. But is it telling us that it's going to be a disembodied spiritual reality? Most certainly not. It's definitely not saying that, and it has the assumption that that would not be the case. So there you go. Those are the positions. We've got a lot going on. And as we wrap up this Revelation study, I hope it's been helpful. I know we've looked at a ton of different stuff. We've examined a lot of different viewpoints, and for the most part, not overweighed in on which one is right or which one's wrong. I'm hoping it's given you a lot to think about, and that hopefully you'll have a chance to continue to look at Revelation, maybe read through it a few more times, think about each position, think about what God is saying to you through it, and find things that you can be confident in for sure. Like, I know God is saying this through this passage. Find things where you think you have the right view. I think it's saying this, and find other things where you can recognize that there's more than one way to read it and not have certainty on things that we don't need to be certain on. And that's really the challenge of a reader of Revelation, right? To be certain on the things that are clear and to not be overly certain on the things that are ambiguous. And for me, it's been quite a journey. I hope it has been for you as well. And so God bless, and we're wrapping this one up, and I hope it's been helpful.